The Last of Us Episode 2. Today's episode surprised me, and I'm sure many others, when it started off with a scene set 20 years ago at the start of the outbreak. This is not from the game, so it's at this point that the show is actually doing its own sort of world building and branching out by sort of, adding its own scenes and storytelling to try and expand the world in that sense. And this flashback is set in, I believe, Indonesia. I hope I got that right. And this was an interesting flashback. This is supposedly where the outbreak starts, where, it's kind of like the ground zero for this whole thing. And we get an interesting look at the infection and how it works and how the fungus sort of spreads and moves. It's an interesting look at it, because obviously the game never really goes into that. It's sort of you have the opening segment of the game that's set 20 years before, and people are just infected, and then you just sort of jump forward. And we saw a focus on the infection throughout the episode, and we see that the infection is working a little differently in the show compared to the game. There's no spores seemingly in the show when they're sort of a main thing in the game. We also see how the fungus moves, particularly in an infected person's mouth. These sort of little, I don't know what you'd call them, tentacles, tendrils, you know what I mean? Like little things come out of the mouth, and then I think that's when a bite is taking place. It's like those tendrils go in and it spreads into another person, and it's like they sort of die, but then they're reanimated as the things grow out of them and begin to take control. It's an interesting change. I don't really mind the things they've changed with how the infection works and spreads and it sort of appears. I think the spores sort of made sense for how easy it would be for an infection to spread rather than just biting. With spores, you breathe it in, you're infected, but I haven't seen any spores in the show, so I assume they're not really using that as a method of spreading the infection. But yeah, the show is having more of a focus on the infection, and it's more interested with telling us as viewers, how it works and how it spread and how it started. And whilst that's interesting, whilst it is kind of, that curiosity to get to know more about the infection that takes place in The Last of Us, I hope it doesn't become too much of a focal point, because the thing with this game and what makes it unique to other zombie shows and movies and games is the fact that whilst the zombies are really cool in The Last of Us, it's not what you think of first. What you think of first is the characters and the relationships and the story and just all the events that take place in this game. It's really about the characters more than the infection, but obviously they're really trying to tell us more about this cordyceps infection, so I just hope they don't roll with it too much, because I don't think that is the strength of this story. I think it's a very strong point, but I don't think it is the main strength. It'll be interesting to see whether they start more of these future episodes with a scene that is set 20 years back, like if they're going to do that week to week, sort of showing week in, week out how the infection started to spread and make its way around the world. I don't know if they're going to do that. I mean, whilst it's cool, I do kind of like these scenes that are, exploring just sort of random people and the start of the outbreak. I don't want them to do it too much, or at least not spend too much screen time on it, because I think we really need to spend as much screen time with Joel and Ellie, because obviously they're having to cut things from this show in order to fit it into like this 10-hour runtime from a game that's probably double that length. So I just think they need to make sure they manage the time wisely and still give enough time to character build Joel and Ellie and tell all the important points of the story. But anyway, moving on. This episode followed Joel and Tess as they are escorting Ellie to the Capitol building to hand her off to the Fireflies. But this is no easy task, as they have to weave through the city that isn't completely free of infected. This was a solid episode. I wouldn't say it was as good as last week's, but it did have this slower pace, and I think that worked for me. I did actually enjoy this sort of slower pace. We kind of calmed it down a little bit, and I enjoyed that because it really allowed for character building and character development, particularly between Joel and Ellie. You kind of get these little moments where you see the way he looks at her, and then he looks at his watch straight after, and then you can already obviously see how he's starting to think of his daughter now that he's escorting this 14-year-old girl across. It's kind of like all flooding back to him again. But the thing I was most anticipating for this episode was the clickers. I had a good feeling, obviously, they were going to be in this episode, and they were, and they did not disappoint. I thought they were really, really impressive. The makeup / CG, I want to say. I think it's a mix of both at times. But yeah, I think that was really, really impressive. The sound design, the performances, you know, like from the people playing the clickers, it's really, really top notch. And I think they nailed that with how it comes across in the game. My heart was racing through that whole scene, even though I kind of know what's going to happen because of the game, but obviously it pans out differently, it plays out differently, and it was very tense and very exciting. And you see how tricky it is just to kill a clicker because they've got these big sort of hard mushroom, you know, like just growing out of their heads and stuff. But that was a really, really great segment. Obviously, they're very true to the game, but speaking of true to the game, there are things, as I mentioned, with how the infection works. Obviously, that's a change, and there's also a change at the end of this episode in regards to Tess's death, and infected show up rather than military. In the game, the military show up. In this show, a horde of infected show up. Again, I think this show's emphasis on the infection is what sort of brought them to change it at this point, because they mentioned earlier on in the episode how if you like step on a certain part of like fungus on the ground, you know, it's like a hive and it's all connected on the ground, and that can wake up infected like a mile down the road, and they're all sort of in sync, as you see at one point in the episode, like they all sort of move together, and like it's like a hive mind going on, which is an interesting idea. I didn't really think that's how it worked in the game, but I guess so. I thought they were just kind of like zombies where they run for the noise, but apparently they're all kind of in sync, which is okay, whatever. But yeah, because of that infected show up here rather than the military, in a scene where Tess sort of is infected already, so therefore she's gonna, you know, sort of like be heroic and try and take a few down before, you know, they get anywhere near Joel and Ellie, so Joel and Ellie can escape. But I just wonder with changes like this, like, are they just doing it for the sake of doing it? Or are they doing it because... And what seems to me is that they want to have more of a focus on the infection. I know I keep mentioning it, but it really does feel like they really are trying to delve into that more. I mean, we'll see in the coming weeks if they just sort of pan away from that. But it really seems like that's something they're very interested in delving into. Hence why they're having more infected related events in the show. But you know, we're 2 episodes in, and last week didn't really have that much infected in after the flashback. It's just today we kind of got a lot of it. But you know, I'm not against it. As I said last week, they are making changes, and it's almost making it a fresh take for people like me who are familiar with the game and familiar with that version of the story. This is a different version of the story, so in no way am I being critical of what I've seen in episode 2. I'm just noting the changes, and I'm curious about them. You know, I'm not really sure how I feel about them yet. It might be hard to say until I get to the end of the show. You know, I know of one story before this told a certain way, and I love how it's told that way. So this I'm just sort of adjusting to. But as long as the sole focus of this show remains on Joel and Ellie and that story, I need that to really be the heart of the show, and I think it will be. I think we're just, you know, getting some cool infection stuff as well. You know, I don't think the showrunners are gonna really, you know, delve too far away from that, and Neil Druckmann directed this episode, so I'm sure he'll do the wise thing here. You know, I think he's a pretty wise man overall, but I hated the second game story-wise, so that was a bit of a cock-up, but we won't talk about that. But yeah, this is a very solid episode. I think there's some really cool moments in here. There's also some little Easter eggs you might notice in here. There was a giraffe toy on the ground at one point. If you played the game, you'll know the giraffe toy. But yeah, I just thought this episode as a whole was very solid. It moved the story along nicely. The pacing, again, very impressive. They're knowing what to cut and what not to cut, and we're moving through these chapters very efficiently, and I'm just really, really pleased with how this show's turning out so far, and I can't wait for next week's episode. I would give today's episode an 8.5 out of 10. If you've seen it, let me know what you think about it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.